Every September, something quietly divides gardeners into two groups. One group puts away their tools. They cover the raised beds. They coil up the hoses. They accept that the growing season is over and start thinking about spring. The other group does something almost no one in their neighborhood is doing. They get on their knees. They press seeds into warm September soil. And in October, in November, sometimes in the dead of December, they are still walking outside and harvesting food. Here is what the first group doesn't know: September soil is among the most productive planting ground in the entire year. The warmth still stored from summer drives fast germination, and the cool air rolling in through October is not the enemy of vegetables for most of them. It is the trigger that makes them taste the way they were always meant to. Today, we are breaking down 12 vegetables you need to get in the ground this September, drawn from ancient growing traditions that stretch back 4,000 years, and confirmed by what modern gardeners keep rediscovering every fall. Pay attention to number 1. It's a plant that fed armies, appeared in ancient pharmacies, and has been growing unnoticed in backyards across America for decades. And stay with us for number 6, because the story of how one man in a wilderness garden survived on what the soil quietly provided is among the most striking things Scripture ever recorded about the relationship between human beings and the earth. Number 12. Mech corn salad. Lamb's lettuce. Most American gardeners have never heard of mosh. That absence from the American gardening conversation is the first thing worth examining, because in France, in Belgium, in the cold-growing regions of Northern Europe, mosh has been the winter salad staple for centuries. It grows through hard frosts that would kill spinach. It keeps producing slowly and reliably through December and January. While every other salad plant in your garden quietly dies, mosh simply continues. The Book of Numbers, chapter 11, records the Israelites in the wilderness, cataloging the plants they remembered from Egypt. Among them, wild greens that grew in poor, disturbed soil at the margins of agriculture. Ancient Egyptian records from the Ebers Papyrus period describe small-leafed salad greens, specifically suited to winter cultivation and gathered by the common population through the cold months of the Nile Valley's growing calendar. Scholars of ancient Mediterranean agriculture have suggested that low-rosette winter greens plants that survived cold through dense, ground-hugging growth were among the most important cold-season food sources in the ancient world. Mosh fits that description precisely. What is striking is that Roman agricultural writers, Pliny the Elder, among them, recorded the use of a plant matching mosh's description as a winter salad green, cultivated in kitchen gardens across the Italian peninsula. Medieval European monastic gardens, which were among the most sophisticated food-producing institutions of the era, grew it specifically for the winter months when other greens were unavailable. The convergence of Mediterranean, Northern European, and Middle Eastern traditions around a plant of this description: mild, cold, hardy, low-growing, productive in winter, is not coincidental. It reflects genuine agricultural intelligence passed across cultures that rarely communicated directly. Modern nutritional analysis confirms what centuries of cultivation intuited. Mosh delivers meaningful concentrations of beta-carotene, folate, and vitamin C, and what is less commonly discussed is its iron content per gram, which measures higher than most leafy greens, including spinach. The omega-3 fatty acid profile of mosh leaves, specifically alpha-linolenic acid, has drawn recent research attention. Studies suggest that for a salad green, mosh carries an unusually favorable omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, relevant for populations whose diets tend to run heavily toward omega-6 dominant seed oils. The research on mosh's specific nutrient contributions is still developing, but results are consistent enough to support continued interest. Most American seed aisles do not carry mosh. Look for it under the names mosh, corn salad, or lamb's lettuce through specialty seed suppliers. Online seeds are inexpensive and readily available. Broadcast seeds over a prepared bed in September. The plant grows as a low, dense rosette and performs well in relatively compact plantings, so it fits along the edges of any existing bed without demanding its own space. Harvest individual rosettes when they reach 2 to 3 inches across. The flavor is mild and slightly nutty, genuinely different from any other green in a fall salad bowl. And worth tasting. Every winter garden in the ancient world had something like mosh. They didn't have grocery stores. They had the wisdom to grow what the cold season would actually support. The research is now beginning to explain the nutritional reasons why. Number 11. Arugula. Arugula has a reputation problem, and it is almost entirely seasonal. Summer arugula, grown in heat and long days, develops an intense, sometimes overwhelming peppery bite. It is the arugula that many people try once and set aside. Fall arugula is a categorically different experience. As temperatures drop, the same plant softens. The peppery character rounds off. September and October arugula carries a clean, mild warmth, interesting, present, but not aggressive, and a nuttiness that summer arugula rarely shows. The Romans called it eruca and considered it both a salad plant and a medicinal herb. Pliny wrote about it in his Naturalis Historia, one of the most detailed descriptions of ancient food plant culture that survives. In the classical Mediterranean world, arugula was grown and consumed so routinely that Roman agricultural writers discussed optimal planting seasons, and the consensus was autumn. Medieval Arab physicians in the Islamic Golden Age, pharmacological tradition, Ibn Sina, among them, listed arugula as a digestive aid and documented its cultivation in the garden texts of that era. The independent recognition of this plant's value across Roman, Arab, and Eastern Mediterranean traditions carries its own weight. The glucosinolate compounds in arugula, the same sulfur-containing chemicals that characterize the broader Brassica family, have received research attention for their role in supporting the liver's detoxification pathways. One specific glucosinolate, glucoerucin, is more concentrated in arugula than in most other Brassica plants and converts enzymatically to erucin, a compound with antioxidant properties that researchers have identified as worth ongoing study. The nitrate content of arugula, naturally occurring dietary nitrate, not the synthetic form found in processed meats, supports nitric oxide production in the body, which has implications for cardiovascular function that researchers continue to examine. Arugula grown in cool fall conditions may actually concentrate these compounds more efficiently than summer-grown plants, because slower cellular growth in cooler temperatures tends to increase secondary metabolite density. Arugula is ready to harvest in 21 to 25 days. Plant in September and eat fresh greens before October ends. Cut with scissors an inch above the soil. When leaves reach 2 to 3 inches small, arugula is mild and nutty. Full-size mature arugula can become sharp again. New leaves grow back within 10 days. 2 plantings, 2 weeks apart, give you continuous, mild, fresh arugula from late September through November. Use it raw in salads, or wilt it briefly into a hot pan with olive oil and a little garlic. It collapses to almost nothing and seasons a dish more gently than you would expect. Autumn was always arugula's season. That was not a preference. That was design. Number 10. Wischat. Swiss chard is the most quietly reliable vegetable in a fall garden. It doesn't ask for perfect timing. It doesn't demand afternoon shade or precisely moist soil through germination. It handles the transition from late summer heat to November cold without complaint, and it keeps producing across the entire arc of that change. In the ancient Hebrew agricultural tradition, the term oroth, appearing in the book of 2 Kings, Chapter 4 describes wild pot herbs gathered from the field and cooked in a communal stew. Biblical scholars and agricultural historians have suggested this term likely covered a range of leafy greens, including beet family plants, the botanical family that Swiss chard belongs to. The scene is a famine period. Scholars of ancient Near Eastern agriculture describe leafy greens of the beet family as among the most important food sources during scarcity. They were easy to grow in disturbed soil, required no elaborate cultivation, and produced reliably across seasons. Ancient Egyptian agricultural records describe beet family greens cultivated along irrigation channels for both food and medicine. In traditional Chinese medicine plants, in the Chenopodiaceae family, the botanical grouping that includes Swiss chard and its relatives were documented in classical pharmacopoeias as cooling, blood-nourishing, and supportive of liver function. The convergence between ancient Egyptian, Levantine, and Chinese recognition of this family of plants is worth noting. These traditions developed largely independently and arrived at similar functional assessments. Swiss chard contains betalains, the same class of pigments responsible for beets' deep red color, which have been studied for antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. One detail: most people who cook chard never learn the betalain concentration is highest in the stems, not the leaves. Most home cooks discard or underuse the stems. This is precisely the part of the plant worth preserving. The leaves and stems of Swiss chard also cook at different rates, a detail that matters in the kitchen. The leaves wilt in 2 minutes in a hot pan. The thick stems need 4 to 5 more minutes. Separate them at harvest. Cook stems first. Add leaves at the end. Same plant. 2 textures. 1 meal cooked correctly. Bright lights or rainbow chard with stems in red, orange, yellow, and white is among the most visually striking vegetables in any fall garden. And the colors reflect different concentrations of betalain pigments across the spectrum. Swiss chard will still be growing in your garden in December. Plant it now. In September. That patience is worth something. Number 9. Turnips. Turnips have an image problem built entirely on one specific eating experience: a large, old, overgrown root that has gone starchy, fibreux, and sharp. That is not what a turnip is. That is what a turnip becomes when you leave it in the ground too long. A turnip pulled at golf ball size from a September planting, maturing in October, cool air, is middle, slightly sweet, and crisp enough to eat raw. Most people who grew up with turnips as a hated vegetable have never eaten one at this stage. Turnips appear in the ancient agricultural record far earlier than most people realize. The Roman agricultural writer Columella, writing in the 1st century, described turnips as one of the most important staple crops in the Roman peasant diet, providing both root vegetables and cooking greens from a single plant. In classical Ayurvedic texts, root vegetables of the Brassica family were described as grounding, warming, and supportive of digestive function, particularly when cooked simply and consumed in the cold months. Medieval European agricultural manuals compiled in the monasteries of France and Germany during the 8th through 12th centuries list turnips as among the primary root vegetables grown specifically for winter use. What most people never discover is that one September planting of turnips produces 2 harvests. The greens, the leafy tops, are edible from 30 days onward, weeks before the root is ready. Cooked simply like mustard greens, they are peppery, tender, and substantial. 1 planting, 2 crops. The first harvest arrives in a month. The glucosinolates present in turnip greens, the same sulfur compounds found throughout the Brassica family, have been studied for their potential to support the liver's phase 2 detoxification processes. With research findings that scientists consider worthy of continued investigation, the root itself provides meaningful levels of vitamin C and folate. And fall-harvested turnips, pulled after cold nights, have triggered the starch-to-sugar conversion common across the Brassica family, deliver more natural sweetness than the same variety harvested in summer. The Hakare Japanese salad turnip is the variety that has converted more turnip skeptics than anything else currently available to American gardeners. Small, smooth, white, and mild enough to eat raw with nothing but a pinch of salt. It is available through specialty nurseries and online seed suppliers. Slice it thin and dress it simply a little rice vinegar, a little sesame oil, a few moments to let the flavor speak. The ancients did not grow turnips because they had no better option. They grew them because a plant that gives you food in 30 days, then again in 60, through cold conditions that stop almost everything else, is a plant worth understanding. Number 8. Beets. Most people plant beets and wait for the root. There are actually 2 completely separate harvests from one beet planting, and the majority of home gardeners take only one. The Book of Ezekiel, Chapter 4, records God directing the prophet to bake bread from a mixture that included common field crops, a passage that agricultural historians have interpreted as a catalog of drought and scarcity foods drawn from the common subsistence knowledge of the period. Beet family plant, including what we now call chard and the beet plant itself, were among the most cultivated vegetables in ancient Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. The word sekel, in ancient Hebrew agricultural texts, has been linked to beet family plants in the scholarly literature on biblical agriculture. Ancient Egyptian cultivation records from the period of the New Kingdom describe beet-related plants grown specifically in kitchen gardens for both root and leaf use. In Roman culinary culture, beet greens, not the root, were considered the more valuable part of the plant. Apicius, the first-century Roman cookbook, contains multiple recipes for beet greens prepared with olive oil, fish sauce, and herbs. While the root appears far less frequently, Byzantine medical texts from the 5th through 7th centuries described beet preparations as blood-building and liver-supporting, a characterization that modern research has begun to examine through the lens of the betalains and nitrates these plants contain. Beet greens are edible from 30 days onward, weeks before the roots are ready. Sautéed with garlic and olive oil in minutes. They taste like mild, slightly earthy spinach. One of the quickest and most satisfying harvests a fall garden provides. The roots follow at 55 to 70 days. Sweetened by the cold nights of November. Pull beets when the shoulder visible at the soil surface is 2 to 3 inches across. Past that point, texture goes woody and sweetness fades. Chioggia beets, with their concentric pink and white rings inside, are among the most visually striking vegetables in any fall garden. Cut one open in November, and it looks like something from a design magazine. The dietary nitrates in beets have been examined in clinical research contexts for their effects on circulation and exercise efficiency. With results that researchers consider promising, though, the science on optimal intake amounts and preparation methods continues to develop. 2 harvests. 1 planting, September to November. The Romans understood the arithmetic. Most modern gardeners are still leaving half the harvest on the plant. Number 7. Collard greens. Collard greens are the toughest leafy vegetable in the American home garden. Tougher than kale, more cold-tolerant than chard, more heat-resistant than spinach. And the first frost does not end them, it improves them. Collards appear in the ancient agricultural record under a different name. But the plant is unmistakable. The cultivated brassicas of the ancient Mediterranean world, described by Greek and Roman writers as broad-leafed, non-heading greens used for both food and medicine, are botanical predecessors of what we now call collard greens. Theophrastus, the Greek botanist, writing in the 3rd century BCE, and considered the father of botany, documented flat-leafed brassica types, cultivated specifically for winter harvesting. In West and Central African agricultural traditions, where collard greens found their most sustained and sophisticated culinary development, leafy brassicas were integrated into cooking practices that predate contact with European cultivated varieties, suggesting independent parallel cultivation of closely related plants. The African-American culinary tradition that made collards a staple of Southern cooking carried that deep agricultural intelligence into a new geography, preserving through practice what European-American gardening largely overlooked. The glucosinolate profile of collard greens is among the most diverse of any brassica vegetable. Collards contain meaningful concentrations of glucoraphanin, gluconasturtin, and glucotropiolin, each generating different isothiocyanate compounds upon enzymatic conversion. What is less commonly known is that collards also carry one of the highest calcium contents of any common vegetable, higher than milk, by some measures on a calorie-for-calorie basis, and the calcium in collards is more bioavailable than calcium in spinach, because collards contain significantly lower oxalic acid levels. Traditional Southern cooking practice of long simmering collards with a small amount of fat and an acidic component vinegar, or the acidity from tomatoes is functionally sound. The fat supports fat-soluble nutrient absorption, and the acid helps release calcium from plant cell walls. The pot liquor left after cooking collards contains water-soluble vitamins, including folate and vitamin K, and drinking it, as was traditional preserved nutrients that modern practice discards with the cooking water. Cold triggers the same starch-to-sugar conversion in collards that sweetens kale and carrots in fall. A plant that was bold and slightly bitter in October becomes richer, sweeter, and more deeply savory after a hard November frost. In zones 5 and 6, plan for a harvest window of 6 to 8 weeks before hard freezes close the season, still a generous fall harvest worth planting for. In zones 7 and warmer, collards planted in September produce through fall and keep going into winter, sometimes into the following spring. Space plants, 18 inches apart, they get large. Harvest the lower outer leaves first. The plant keeps producing upward for months. One September, planting feeds you well past the point when everything else in your garden has finished. The people who carried this plant across continents and through generations of hardship were not making a culinary choice. They were preserving a food that would not fail them when conditions were difficult. The research on its nutrient density is now beginning to confirm what that accumulated trust already knew. Number 6. Kale. Stay with us. The story coming with this one changes how you think about what food is actually for. Kale is one of the oldest cultivated vegetables in human history. And what is remarkable is that for most of that history, people grew it specifically for the cold season, not the warm one. The kale most people have eaten was grown in summer heat. It is tough. It is slightly bitter. It is edible. But it is not what kale is meant to be. Kale, that has been through a hard frost, is a completely different food. When temperatures drop to freezing, kale converts its stored starches into sugars as a natural survival mechanism, a physiological response to protect cellular membranes from ice crystal formation. The leaves after frost are sweeter, more tender, and milder than anything produced in warm weather. This is not a culinary preference. This is chemistry. The Book of 1 Kings, chapter 19, records the prophet Elijah in the wilderness at a moment of complete collapse, physically, emotionally, spiritually broken. He had fled into the desert after a confrontation with the queen's forces. He lay down under a broom tree in the Negev and asked to die. "It is enough," he said. The text records that he fell asleep. Then an angel touched him and told him to get up and eat. He found beside him a cake baked on hot coals and a jar of water. He ate. He drank. He lay down again. The angel came a second time. "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." He arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights. That is not just poetry. That is a clinical description of severe physical depletion, dehydration, caloric deficit, electrolyte loss followed by cellular restoration through simple food. The elements named in that passage, carbohydrate from grain, water, are exactly what a depleted body needs to restore blood glucose and begin re-establishing basic metabolic function. The detail about the second meal before the long journey is particularly striking. Modern understanding of glycogen replenishment would predict that a single meal is not sufficient to restore the energy stores necessary for 40 days of travel. The text describes exactly what we would now recognize as a deliberate nutritional protocol: rest. First meal. Rest again. Second meal. Then sustained effort. Kale, in that wilderness context, would have been among the most nutrient-dense plants available in the ancient Near East. It is a member of the Brassica oleracea species, one of the oldest cultivated plant forms in the Mediterranean world. Greek farmers cultivated it before the classical period. Roman agricultural writers described it as among the most important of winter vegetables. Ancient Egyptian medical texts reference Brassica family greens in preparations for cold weather ailments. The specific glucosinolates in kale sinegrin, glucoraphanin, and gluconopin, among them, are converted by the enzyme myrosinase upon cell damage chewing, chopping, or light cooking into isothiocyanates, compounds that have been studied extensively for their effects on cellular defense mechanisms. The research on sulforaphane, one of the primary isothiocyanates derived from kale, has produced findings that scientists consider significant enough to sustain clinical investigation into its potential roles in supporting healthy aging, cellular repair processes. What is counterintuitive and worth knowing, boiling kale in large quantities of water and discarding that water destroys a substantial portion of the glucosinolates before they can convert. Steaming, light sautéing, or massaging raw kale retains far more of the active chemistry. The pot liquor, the water left after boiling, contains leached water-soluble compounds. Traditional Southern cooking practice of drinking or cooking with pot liquor was nutritionally sound in a way that was never formally recognized. Lacinato, kale, and Red Russian are the two varieties most recommended for fall harvest quality. Harvest outer leaves and leave the center growing. One plant keeps producing through November, and in zone 7 and warmer, well into winter. Plant in September. Let the first frost arrive. Then harvest. Elijah rose and walked 40 days on what the ground provided. The journey was too great for him, and the food made it possible. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, the way old wisdom keeps turning out to be, hit like and subscribe. What's coming in the top 5 goes even deeper. Number 5. Carrots. Carrots, planted in September, taste better than spring carrots. This is not a preference. It is chemistry. Cold temperatures in October and November trigger carrots to convert stored starches into sugars, the same survival mechanism that improves kale and beets in fall. A carrot pulled after several cold nights is measurably sweeter than the same variety pulled in June. Most people who grow carrots exclusively in spring have never tasted this vegetable at its best. The carrot in its domesticated form was first cultivated in the region of modern Afghanistan, and it spread westward through Persia, into the Arab world, and eventually into Europe, followed trade and conquest routes in a well-documented historical arc. Ancient Persia, the civilization that gave us the Avesta. The classical medical texts of the Zoroastrian tradition recorded root vegetables of this family as warming, digestive, and sustaining through cold months. The spread of the carrot to medieval Europe came largely through the Islamic Golden Age agricultural exchanges, Arab agronomists in Spain, writing in the 10th and 11th centuries, described carrot cultivation practices in detail, and these texts became foundational for European vegetable cultivation in the centuries that followed. Ibn Sina, writing in the 11th century, discussed carrot root preparations in his Canon of Medicine, documenting their use as digestive aids and nutrient sources across the cold season. The beta-carotene in carrots, the compound responsible for the orange color, is a fat-soluble nutrient. What most people preparing carrots never learn is that beta-carotene absorption from raw carrots is relatively poor, typically estimated at 10 to 30% compared to cooked carrots prepared with a small amount of fat, where absorption increases substantially. The heat from cooking breaks down the cell walls that lock beta-carotene into the plant matrix. The fat provides the medium the body needs to absorb it. A simple preparation of roasted carrots with a little olive oil is, nutritionally speaking, dramatically more effective than the same carrots eaten raw. Traditional cuisines across the Mediterranean and Middle East almost universally cooked their carrots with fat, and that practice reflected accumulated practical wisdom about what the body actually absorbed. The challenge with September carrot planting is germination. Carrot seeds need the top layer of soil to stay consistently moist. In early September, that surface layer dries out fast. The fix after sowing: lay a piece of burlap directly over the row. It holds surface moisture without blocking air. Check underneath every morning. The moment tiny green sprouts appear, remove it immediately so seedlings get full light. Choose Danvers or Nantes varieties shorter and stockier, pushing through average fall soil reliably. Plant in the first half of September. Harvest sweet cold-touched carrots in November. They ate cooked root vegetables with oil for thousands of years before anyone knew what beta-carotene was. The chemistry was always there. Number 4. Spinach. Spring spinach is always racing against the clock. A few good weeks. Heat builds, the plant bolts, and the leaves turn bitter before a real harvest has begun. Fall spinach is a completely different experience, and the difference extends well beyond flavor. Spinach appears in the materia medica of the Islamic Golden Age with remarkable regularity. It was one of the vegetables introduced to medieval Europe through Arab agricultural influence in Spain, carried from its origins in ancient Persia. The Persian word aspinach, the etymological root of the English word spinach, appears in agricultural and medical texts from the Sassanid period, where the plant was valued both as food and as medicine. Ibn Sina describes spinach as cooling, moistening, and particularly useful for respiratory conditions. In traditional Chinese medicine, spinach was classified among the yin foods cooling, blood-nourishing, and classical Chinese texts from the Tang dynasty describe its cultivation and medical applications. The independent convergence of Persian, Arab, and Chinese medical traditions around this plant over roughly the same historical period is a pattern worth considering. Spinach contains oxalic acid, a naturally occurring compound that binds to certain minerals in the digestive tract, particularly calcium and iron, reducing their absorption from spinach specifically. This is a genuine nutritional consideration, but one that traditional food cultures handled through practice without knowing the mechanism. Combining spinach with vitamin C sources lemon, tomato helps compensate for the mineral binding effect, and cooking reduces oxalic acid concentration measurably. Blanching spinach in boiling water for 60 to 90 seconds and discarding the water removes a portion of the oxalates, a technique used in traditional Middle Eastern spinach preparations for centuries, likely for flavor reasons, but functionally sound in terms of mineral availability. The folate content of spinach, relevant for cell division and DNA synthesis, is among the highest of any common vegetable. Folate is heat sensitive and degrades with extended cooking. The optimal preparation for preserving folate is light wilting 30 to 60 seconds in a hot pan, or a brief warm water blanch rather than extended cooking. The magnesium in spinach is more bioavailable than most people assume, particularly when the leaves are young and the oxalic acid concentration is lower. Young fall spinach leaves, harvested when small and tender, represent the best nutritional window of the plant cycle. Seeds planted in September germinate fast in warm soil and then grow into cool October air. The leaves that come in October are sweeter, more tender, and more flavorful than anything spring produced. In zones 5 and 6, plant in the first 2 weeks of September. In zones 7 and warmer, you have through the end of the month. Look for Bloomsdale longstanding or any slow bolt variety. Harvest outer leaves and leave the center growing. One planting feeds you into November in zone 7 and warmer. Through December and beyond, Persia carried this plant to the world. The world eventually learned, through entirely independent scientific investigation, why it was worth carrying. Number 3. Garlic. Garlic does not reward you this season. Planted in September or October, and the bulbs will not be ready until next July. But it earns its place on this list near the top, because September is the only planting window that exists for it. And what garlic is, in the full account of human history, justifies the patience. Garlic appears in the ancient world with a frequency that borders on the extraordinary. Numbers chapter 11 records the Israelites in the wilderness mourning the foods of Egypt. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for free. The cucumbers, melon, laix, onions, and garlic. This is one of the earliest written records of a specific food plant in history, and garlic is named last as if it were the final word on the subject. In the Egyptian agricultural tradition, garlic was documented as a daily ration for the laborers building the pyramids, recorded in hieroglyphic accounts that archaeologists have interpreted as production and distribution logs. Ancient Egypt considered garlic important enough to track administratively. Hippocrates described garlic in the classical Greek medical tradition as useful for respiratory conditions, parasitic infections, and wound care. Dioscorides cataloged it in his 1st century pharmacopoeia. Roman soldiers carried it on campaign as a standard medicinal provision. The continuity of garlic's documented use from ancient Egypt through Greece, Homi, the Islamic Golden Age, medieval European herbalism, and into modern clinical research is unbroken, spanning more than 5,000 years. The primary active compound in garlic allicin is not present in the raw, intact clove. It is produced through an enzymatic reaction between the compound alliin and the enzyme alliinase. When the plant's cell walls are broken by cutting or crushing, this reaction is temperature-sensitive heat, rapidly deactivates a lionase, and prevents a lysine formation. The practical implication, and this is not widely known even among health-conscious cooks, is that garlic should be crushed or chopped and then allowed to rest for 10 to 15 minutes before heat is applied. During that window, the allicin-generating reaction runs to completion. Adding garlic directly to a hot pan, without that resting period, produces far lower allicin concentrations in the finished dish. This is a preparation detail that has real nutritional consequence, and it is almost never communicated in standard cooking instruction. Traditional preparations in many Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cuisines where garlic is crushed in a mortar, combined with other ingredients, and allowed to rest before cooking may have preserved this functional detail through accumulated culinary practice without anyone naming the mechanism. Hardneck garlic produces a flowering stalk called a scape in late spring, a bonus crop available weeks before the bulbs mature. Harvest the scapes before they curl fully, and you have an intense fresh garlic flavor that nothing in a grocery store replicates. The bulbs come in July. The scapes come in May. 1 planting, 2 harvests. Separated by months. Separate a bulb into individual cloves. Push each one about 2 inches deep, pointed, end up, spaced 6 inches apart. Cover with a few inches of mulch. That is the entire September job. They packed it for the journey out of Egypt. They missed it in the wilderness. The research has spent 5,000 years catching up to what they already knew. Number 2. Broccoli. Most American gardeners have a disappointing broccoli story. Planted in spring. Temperatures rise before the head forms. Small. Loose. Yellowing, and the gardener concludes that broccoli is difficult. Broccoli is not difficult. It was planted at the wrong time. Broccoli is a cool season crop that requires cold temperature exposure to trigger proper head formation, a physiological process called vernalization that warm spring growing conditions actively interrupt. Full broccoli, developing its head in cool October air, is tight, deeply green, and genuinely sweet in a way that spring broccoli rarely achieves. The Brassica oleracea family, the botanical grouping that includes broccoli, kale, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and collards, was cultivated in the ancient Mediterranean with remarkable intentionality. Ancient Greek and Roman agricultural writers described cultivated brassica types that sound, in their descriptions, like predecessors of modern broccoli, dense-headed, green-stalked, harvested before flowering. Pliny the Elder described brassica preparations in medical contexts for digestion, for the liver, consumed, cooked, and raw, in different therapeutic applications. In the Roman tradition, the brassica was considered among the most medicinally important of all vegetables, a judgment that is beginning to look increasingly well-founded. The most important nutritional detail about broccoli is one that most people who eat it regularly never know. The sulforaphane precursor compound glucoraphanin, which converts to sulforaphane through the myrosinase enzyme, is concentrated in the broccoli florets, but the conversion is highly sensitive to cooking method. Boiling broccoli in water destroys the myrosinase enzyme almost completely, meaning glucoraphanin cannot convert to sulforaphane in the body as efficiently. Lightly steaming broccoli for 4 to 5 minutes, leaving it with some structural integrity, preserves myrosinase function substantially. More strikingly, adding a small amount of raw food that contains active myrosinase raw mustard powder, fresh radish, or even a few raw broccoli sprouts to cooked broccoli has been shown in research settings to compensate for the enzyme loss from heat Broccoli sprouts, grown from seed in 3 to 5 days on a kitchen counter, contain 10 to 100 times more glucoraphanin than mature broccoli. The enzyme in a small quantity of fresh sprouts, added after cooking, restores most of the sulforaphane generating capacity that heat destroyed. This is preparation knowledge that is effectively absent from mainstream nutritional communication. Use transplants for September planting. An established root system handles remaining September warmth and starts producing heads as cool weather builds. After cutting the main head, do not pull the plant. Side shoots develop from the base and leaf joints, for weeks afterwards smaller than the main head, but equally flavorful. One September planting extends your broccoli season well into November, across most of the country. They observed that brassica plants were valuable enough to cultivate intensively and document medically. Thousands of years later, researchers are characterizing the mechanism compound by compound. Number 1. Lettuce. This is the one that surprises people. Not garlic, not broccoli, not kale. Lettuce. Here is why lettuce earns this position of every plant on this list. Lettuce is the one that most completely transforms between spring and fall, and it is the one that most home gardeners have largely given up on, written off after bitter summer harvests. Return to bagged salad from the grocery store, believing they simply cannot grow it well. They were growing it in the wrong season. The word for lettuce in ancient Aramaic kasa appears in the Talmudic record as one of the bitter herbs required at Passover maror, consumed as a reminder of the bitterness of slavery. This designation has puzzled later commentators, because lettuce as modern people know it is not bitter. But wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, and its relatives, contains a milky latex called lactucarium, a bitter compound with mild sedative properties that was used as a medicinal substance in the ancient Near East and documented in ancient Egyptian medical texts as a treatment for pain and insomnia. Wild lettuce preparations appear in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, dating to approximately 1550 BCE. The domestication of lettuce from its wild, bitter relatives is one of the longer botanical transformation stories in agricultural history. Cultivated lettuce was already being grown in ancient Egypt as early as 2700 BCE. Depicted in tomb paintings, explicitly associated with the fertility god Min, the Romans spread cultivated lettuce varieties across the empire, and medieval Arab physicians documented specific lettuce preparations for sleep support and anxiety, a use that connects directly to the lactucarium content of the plant's wild ancestors. What almost no mainstream source on fall gardening ever addresses the reason fall lettuce tastes fundamentally different from summer lettuce is not only temperature, but light. Lettuce bolt sends up a seed stalk and turns bitter in response to long days and rising temperatures. The physiological trigger is photoperiod. As day length shortens past a threshold, the bolt signal is suppressed. September and October days are shortening at a rate that lettuce finds genuinely favorable. The plant settles. It grows leaves rather than seed stalks. The bitterness associated with bolting, caused by sesquiterpene lactones accumulating in the leaf tissue, never develops because the genetic program that would produce it is not activated. Fall lettuce is not just sweeter because it is cooler. It is sweeter because the fundamental hormonal program driving it is running differently. The lactucarium compounds in lettuce present in trace amounts even in cultivated varieties, far higher in wild relatives, have been examined in preliminary research for mild anxiolytic and sedative properties. The results are early, and the science is still developing. But the pattern across ancient Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Islamic Golden Age medical documentation of lettuce's calming properties is consistent enough that modern researchers consider it worth further investigation. That this effect was documented repeatedly across cultures that had no contact with each other, in medical traditions that used entirely different theoretical frameworks, is itself a kind of evidence. Butterhead and loose-leaf types mature in 45 to 50 days, in fall conditions faster than romaine, which matters as the season shortens. Keep the soil consistently moist during germination. Dry soil in early September is the most common reason. Fall lettuce fails before it establishes. Harvest outer leaves continuously. Keep the center of the plant intact. Fresh salad from your own garden in October. In November. In December, grown from seeds pressed into warm September. Soil is one of those small, recurring pleasures that quietly changes how you relate to food and to the season. The ancient Egyptians depicted it in their tombs. The Romans spread it across a continent. Medieval physicians wrote about its calming properties. September is its moment. Here is the thread that runs through every plant on this list, and it is worth naming clearly. Every one of these vegetables has a chemistry, a specific compound, or a set of them, developed across millions of years of plant evolution that interacts with human biology in ways we are still characterizing. Allicin in garlic, sulforaphane precursors in broccoli, betalains in beets, glucosinolates in kale, lactucarium compounds in lettuce. These are not incidental. They are the functional core of the plant. And here is what the last 100 years of industrial food production have systematically done to most of them. Process them out. High heat destroys myrosinase in broccoli. Boiling leaches betalains into water that gets poured down the drain. Industrial garlic processing eliminates the resting time that allows allicin to form. Refrigeration slows, but doesn't stop the enzymatic degradation of glucosinolates in kale from the moment of harvest. The standard grocery store supply chain harvest. Transport. Cold storage. Distribution. Bagged and sealed is not designed around preserving the biochemically active components of these plants. It is designed around shelf life, visual consistency, and supply chain economics. This is not a conspiracy. It is the predictable result of optimizing a system for the wrong variables. The gardener who presses a seed into warm September soil and harvests what grows 60 days later in the cold of November is bypassing all of that. The kale goes from frost to table in hours. The garlic is whole and dormant until the moment it is crushed and given the minutes it needs. The lettuce is cut and eaten the same morning. The active chemistry is present because nothing in the chain had time or reason to destroy it. Every traditional food culture understood something about this at the level of practice, even when they had no language for sulforaphane or myrosinase or lactucarium. They understood that fresh was different from preserved, that cold-touched was different from heat-grown, that prepared with attention was different from thrown quickly into a pot. The question the research is now beginning to answer, with increasing seriousness, is how much of what those practices protected matters for human health across a lifetime. The results, compound by compound, study by study, are consistent enough to keep that investigation going. What did your family grow in September? What fall garden tradition from your grandmother? Your culture? Your region? Are you still holding on to? Or have you let go? Drop it in the comments. Someone in a different climate, from a different background, is reading those answers right now and finding something worth trying. Hit like, subscribe. There is more of this here every week. And if there is someone in your life who has written off fall gardening or written off vegetables they tried once at the wrong season, share this with them. The September window is open right now. It will not stay open long.